Well, what do chapters 8, 9, 10, 12, and 26 of the book of Acts have in common? Well, they all mention the city called Caesarea, and that's where we're heading today through a video teaching of this magnificent city. Hope you can join us. Well, shalom once again. Welcome to our teaching channel. And we're all about teaching the Bible in the context of the land of Israel. And that's what we do here at Biblical Israel Ministries and Tours. And if you are new to this channel, we certainly welcome you to look at other teaching videos that we have produced in the past weeks and actually months and years. But we're really developing this to be a real solid place where you can go to learn about the Bible. And that's what we're going to do today, because we're now going to launch some teaching that involves some video from biblical sites. In fact, the next number of dozens of teachings will center around this whole land of Israel with video teaching from each of these sites. And today we're going to Caesarea, and we're going to talk about guys like Philip, who was here for probably about 20 years, Peter, who was also here. He encountered a guy named Cornelius, and then, of course, the Apostle Paul in the later part of the book of Acts, chapter 26 specifically, where he would actually spend 2 years here. Although he was here momentarily in Acts 9, and he sailed in and out of this harbor here at Caesarea a few times as well after his second and third missionary journey. So what we're going to do is go to about an 8 or 9 minute teaching with video. I'm going to show you the Caesarea, different highlights there, and then we'll come back and sort of summarize it all with some good solid application of how we can live out our life of faith in Christ. By the way, let me just tell you a couple of things. Make sure that you hit the subscribe and hit the bell here as we invite you to follow our teaching, and certainly share this with your other friends and family. But also, I want to introduce to you, really for the first time, announce to you the coming of a drone video project that we have now just completed. It'll be available in August on our website, biblicalisraeltours.com. It'll be about an hour and 6 minute or so video featuring 55 biblical sites, all drone video of these sites. Of course, Caesarea is one of them. But make sure that you stay tuned to obtaining your copy of that. I don't think there's anything like this in the evangelical Christian world. So we're excited about this, and we hope it'll be a great resource. It's going to be called Biblical Israel by Air. But with that, let's get started, and let's together travel to Caesarea. We're going to start here in Caesarea at the theater. Now, this has primarily been reconstructed by archaeologists, but it gives us a good sense of what the theater looked like when guys like Philip, this theater had another level to it. Probably seating about 3,000 or 4,000 people. You can see the Mediterranean Sea from here. However, in the front of this theater would have been what is called the skene, sort of the backdrop. But without that skene, today the view is spectacular of the water of the Mediterranean. Along the way over to the palace area, we see numerous archaeological artifacts, including columns and capitals, these being made of different types of marble imported from not only Egypt but also from the area of Europe or Greece. The porphyry, purple marble, is unique to the land. When Paul was here, he was imprisoned for a couple years, probably somewhere near this palace. Now, the palace and what's left of it is nothing too impressive, but in Paul's day it would have been most impressive in terms of the size and, of course, the location of this palace. A portion of the palace actually extended out into the sea, where there was a freshwater swimming pool. After Paul's 2 years here, we recall that he then sailed from the harbor, that we'll see in just a moment, to Rome. However, Paul did sail in and out of this harbor several times at the end of his second and third missionary journeys. In 1961, found in secondary use, was this inscription. Of course, this is a replica. The real one is in the Jerusalem Israel Museum. But it mentions the name Tiberium, who was the emperor at the time, and on the second line, Pilate, the same Pontius Pilate who condemned Jesus to crucifixion. Here is the freshwater swimming pool built by Herod the Great. Incidentally, he built this city over the course of 12 years, between 22 BC and 10 BC. The city also included a hippodrome, although Josephus labeled it a stadium. This is where horses and chariots were raced. The beautiful Mediterranean coastline. Today, the water has taken away half of the hippodrome, but the other part of the hippodrome is still intact today. In fact, we can see it in front of us. This hippodrome would have again been seen by Paul and Peter, and it seems as if Philip lived here also. Here are the original seats of the hippodrome. This was a public arena, if you will. How about taking a spin in this chariot, drawn by these horses? So as we continue to walk northward along the Mediterranean coastline, in this city built by Herod, we see the restoration of many mosaics. A lot of these mosaics are from the later Roman period, but you can see how these are being restored even today. Further north is the Crusader part of the city. In the 12th century, they built massive walls, a moat actually, incorporating their city within these impressive walls. So as we make our way into the Crusader part of the city, we see where the Temple of Augustus once stood, as well as the harbor. Now where you see the green grass would have been water in, let's say, Paul's day. As mentioned before, Paul sailed in and out of this harbor several times. This is where the ships would have been unloaded. Again, think of the green grass as water. So these stones, as a part of this ancient harbor built by Herod, described magnificently by Josephus, incidentally, incorporated these steps leading from the water's edge into the city. Perhaps Paul used these steps himself. This part of the city is constantly being restored today. A team of underwater archaeologists excavated this harbor area in 1986. Nothing much can be seen of it today. Right inside the harbor was this nymphaeon, a fountain, usually for sacred purposes. So as we leave the city, we exit through the Crusader Gate. Very impressive gate, a guillotine gate. You can see the Crusader arches, very typical of that period. The Crusaders were driven out of the city by Baibars in the 13th century BC. Here's one of these moats built around the Crusader City. Outside the city, we still have one more thing to see. Not only is it the Cardo, or the main street of the city, with marble stone, but you can also see the statue of most likely Hadrian, the 2nd century AD Roman emperor. This statue was made of this purple marble. North of the archaeological park is the aqueduct. This was built in order to bring fresh water from the Carmel Range miles away. I typically say 5 or 6 miles away from a spring located there. It had 2 channels, and you can see how great of an engineering feat this must have been. This, again, at least the original aqueduct, dates to the time of Herod the Great, when he built the city. So this is the city known very well by Philip, Peter, and Paul. So I think it's pretty neat to retrace the steps of guys like Philip, who was probably here in Caesarea for 20 years, because early on in his ministry he arrives here at Acts 8, but then when Paul ends his missionary journey later on, it's mentioned in I think about Acts 21, Paul actually stays with Philip, who, by the way, had 4 daughters who prophesied. So that's about a span of about 20 years. But then we have Peter, this disciple of Jesus, who actually fulfills what Jesus predicted in Matthew 16 in the region of Caesarea Philippi, way up north in Israel. This is the context when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And then he continues to say, "And the gates of Hades will not be able to hold back," basically, the kingdom. That's essentially what Jesus was implying. And Caesarea, being a Gentile city, was one of these cities where now the gospel message, the kingdom message, now penetrated into the city, and a guy named Cornelius and all his household become believers in Jesus. It's a beautiful point of redemptive history where now the kingdom is about to explode to Gentiles as well. But then last but not least, we have this guy named Paul. Now, after his conversion in Damascus, he comes back to Jerusalem. They don't think it's real, so then he sails from Caesarea for a moment. So he was here in Acts 9, believe it or not, the harbor that I showed you. He sailed in and out of this harbor actually a number of times, because after his second and third missionary journeys, he also sails in to this harbor. But finally in Acts 26, Paul is here for 2 years. He comes from Jerusalem under heavy guard, and finally in that 26th chapter, he gives a powerful testimony of his faith in Christ, and he basically shares boldly what Jesus did for him, transformed his life. So Paul was sort of a prisoner here, if you will, for 2 years, and after he says, I pray that you would become like me, a Christian, except for these chains, Paul then is on his way to Rome, sailing out of the same harbor that we saw before. So Peter shared his faith boldly, and Paul did the same thing. And of course, Philip, prior to these two guys, no doubt was busy with sharing the kingdom news as well. That's what God calls us to do, to boldly share our faith, no matter the circumstance, no matter the region or the city or the environment, or even the culture. Because, of course, you know, with me, how difficult it is in our very non-Christian culture to share freely our faith. But that's what we have been called to do, and I hope that we learned this lesson here from Caesarea. So thanks for joining us, and hope you follow our next teaching, which will be from a place called Beit Shan, along the Jordan Valley, a little further north. So, until then, shalom, shalom. Thanks for joining us.